Hey everyone, just putting the chat window out so I can see it. It's Sunday, March 22nd, 2026. This is a live shot of the Artemis II vehicle back out on Launchpad 39B. It rolled out on Friday, first half of Friday, March 20th. And we can see a little bit of some of the work that's been done since the vehicle was hard down on the pad around this time 2 days ago. So what I thought I would do, because it requires a little bit less preparation time or production time, is to is to do a is to do sort of a weekly review up at the top of this and then take questions. So that's really the big news in terms of Artemis II watch this week, is that the vehicle is back out on the pad. They rolled out on Friday. They had about a 4-hour delay due to let's see, bring this up. That's the wrong one. Let's see if I can find it. Did I put it? I must have put it in a different place. Aha, this one. So this is just the time lapse of the NASA live stream during the rollout. They had high winds. They planned to begin first motion at around 8 p.m. on Thursday, the 19th, local time, so Eastern Daylight Time. They had to wait for the winds behind a front to die down. And so first motion was around 12:20 a.m. Eastern on Friday, the 20th. And then it took about 9 hours to get out to the pad area, and then they had to do some maintenance on the mobile launcher on a laser part of the laser alignment system before they then completed the roll. They stopped after the crawler had got up onto the pad surface to make that repair, and then replace, and then finished lining it up over the pedestals, and hard down was around 11. I think it was around 11:20 a.m. Eastern on Friday. So while that runs, so you can see pad B in the background there. This is the launch control center over here, and they're sort of panning away, but you can see that as the vehicle gets farther away, it's not the floodlights are on it for while it's in the VAB area, but then those are not good to look straight into, kind of like the sun. And so once the vehicle gets farther away from the Launch Complex 39 area, is technically around the vehicle assembly building, they shut those lights off, and the most of the roll at that point until they get out to the pad is not, they don't put spotlights on it. So kind of going over the overall plan, while that runs, there are no plans for any extra testing at the pad this time. I went over that a few times during the live stream while they were getting the vehicle lined up to hard down on the pad. The thinking for the liquid hydrogen tail service mast umbilical is that they have a good seal. I think it was described was described in the news conference a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was a week and a half ago, as the best seal that they've seen so far in terms of performance. They had very low hydrogen concentrations measured during the second wet dress rehearsal back on February 19th, and they believe the leading candidate in terms of a root cause at this point they think has to do more with how long the seals were originally mated. So they had the leak back on February 2nd during the first wet dress rehearsal test, and at that point those seals had been mated going all the way back to last May of 2025. So they replaced the seals at the pad. They did the second wet dress rehearsal. they measured very low hydrogen concentrations, and they were ready to continue. It's just then they had the helium line in the ICPS umbilical, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage umbilical. One of the quick disconnect seals for that became dislodged and blocked that line, and there's no way to fix that at the pad, so they had to come back for that. So now they're back out at the pad and really going through sort of a standard pad flow without a wet dress rehearsal or without a liquid hydrogen integrity test. So they're planning to press straight into a launch attempt. When they get there will probably be another either a mission management team level briefing or a meeting. This will be private, internal NASA, or an agency level pre-launch meeting to just review their readiness to proceed into the launch count. If they're ready to launch on April 1st, then the launch count would need to start on March 30th, about 48 hours before the T0 time. The T0 time would be about 6:30 p.m. Eastern, which would be about 22:30 GMT on April 1st. So I can go through that. I'll come over here to the slides for that, or just to talk about so this is what we were talking about, and some of the work that's been done since they reached the pad. The crew access arm was extended overnight Friday into Saturday, and they set up the emergency egress system. The slide wires were reattached to the mobile launcher, and then the baskets were run up those lines yesterday, Saturday. And then also overnight Friday into Saturday, the crawler transporter finally rolled out from underneath the mobile launcher, even though it had been lowered down and was not supporting any of the weight of the mobile launcher at the pad at that point. But it's also possible, given the 4-hour delay in the beginning of the roll, that they opted to let the crews go home, leave the crawler there under the mobile launcher, let the crews go home, and then come back the next day and reposition the crawler to outside the pad gate initially, and then as they get closer to the launch date, they will reposition the crawler farther away to something like a launch position. There are a number of different positions once they get outside of a certain danger area where they could either park it at the old Apollo Mobile Service Structure Park site where the observation gantry is right now, or they could in theory go all the way back out to the crawler park site, which is again in the periphery of the vehicle assembly building. But we'll see. It's also possible if they were to launch early in this window, then it'll just be a question of whether the post-launch inspections, post-launch washdown, but eventually the crawler will need to go back out to pick up the mobile launcher one way or the other and bring it back to the vehicle assembly building. So this is the sort of the overview. They've gotten, what my understanding is, they've gotten through most of the pad validations. They've gotten through most of the emergency egress system setup. The countdown demonstration test part 2 is again just a walk down for the flight crew with everything set up. And again, it's possible that they found some time to do that, but it is something that needs to be done when the mobile launcher and the vehicle were out at the pad, and they were so busy between one wet dress rehearsal and the other that they didn't have time. Again, my understanding is they didn't have time to do that, but maybe they found some time in between them. But either way, it's not like a full-blown dry dress rehearsal, which is something they did back in late December when the vehicle was originally in the vehicle assembly building. So a couple of other things that we'll be looking for that are not necessarily time critical. So we're still more than a week and well, not more than a week and a half, but we're about a week and a half from the first from April 1st. So they have time to do this. But these will be visible things that we can look for. And going back to trying to go back to the live view. So this is the live view. The engine and booster service platforms are probably still in the flame hole. They're still providing access to the engine blankets and to the booster aft skirts if anything is necessary. And then it's harder to see here, but the side flame deflectors and extensible columns, both of those will need to be moved into a launch position. So the service platforms will be lowered down onto the pad surface, and they'll roll out somewhere around, it could be right here. I'm not sure if it's this position or if it's a little bit farther down the ramp, but they will be moved away from the flame trench and just farther down the crawler way. And then the side flame deflectors will be moved into position underneath the mobile launcher base / platform. And so we'll see those, and you can kind of see here the white. Those are the white baskets. You can see those baskets which were run up the slide wires. I believe it was yesterday. So those will be the visible preparations, and there will be a lot of other preparations going on. And there were some other post-rollout activities like the crawler provides power to some of the mobile launcher systems, but it does not have enough capacity for things like full purge capabilities. And so they will bring portable purge units along, and those will just be essentially parked on the deck of the mobile launcher. And those allow the engines, for instance, the RS-25 engines need to be kept air conditioned and humidity controlled, for instance. And there's probably other equipment in the engine section and perhaps in the other volumes, like in the inner tank area, the forward skirt area, the RL10 engine for the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. Those all need to be kept somewhat environmentally conditioned during the roll. So if they can't, they have some purge capability, and then they augment it with portable purge units. And then once they're at the pad and they're connected up to the pad's purge systems, to the environmental control systems, then they can run the full purge on using that capability, and then they don't need the portable purge anymore. So there will be things like that they did. And then again, maybe we will see when the crew does the walk down. I'm sort of guessing, depending on how much work they need to do. They fly a lot, so it wouldn't necessarily be out of the question for them to come down. Let me back up. They're supposed to fly to the launch site at L-5 days, but they could come down, tomorrow, for instance, and do that CDDT Part 2 orientation walk down of the emergency egress systems up at the 274 foot level of the mobile launcher, which is where the white room is and where they have access to the baskets in these hypothetical emergency scenarios. So that's something else that they could do that early and then come back come back at the end of the week for launch. But that's something else that we might be looking for. But otherwise, it's going to be relatively. It's going to be harder to see any activities, I would think, other than, again, what we get from public affairs. So March 30th, if the countdown starts on March 30th, that would be a week from tomorrow night. And so if we were to look at again, if I did the math correctly, these would be the planned holds on launch day. And actually, I guess these would be the 3 holds. These would be the quote unquote only 3 planned built-in holds in the countdown. And again, this is the way they do it for this vehicle versus Falcon, which does not have any planned holds. If if I did the math correctly, for an April 1st launch attempt, the first hold would begin around 10 minutes to 6 a.m., and this would be for a 6:24 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time opening of the 2-hour launch window. So they could launch that. That would be the targeted T0 time if they have not, I guess, fully committed to April 1st yet. But if we just go with this for the moment, they would begin that first hold, and I'm using the timings from the second wet dress rehearsal. I have not gotten confirmation that these longer built-in hold period times are what they're going to use, but just going with this hypothetical, the first hold would begin around a few minutes before 6 a.m. on the first, and that would be where the mission management team would have their tanking meeting, and that's where they decide whether they're go, no go for tanking the vehicle and proceeding with a launch attempt on that day. And we would probably see that, assuming things are going well. If they're behind, then not necessarily, but if things are relatively on time, then we might expect to hear that the mission management team is go for tanking before that 2-hour and 45-minute hold is complete, and the countdown clock picks up again at T-minus 8 hours and 10 minutes. And then that whole tanking process that we'll be keeping a very close eye on will be for many hours. But assuming that, the countdown clock will go down to T-minus 3 hours and 30 minutes and hold there. And so that would be, again, if it's on time, would be about 1:15 p.m. And this was the hold, the duration of the hold for the second wet dress rehearsal was 1 hour and 10 minutes. And that would be where they would be targeting, the vehicle for all 4 tanks, liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tanks in both the core stage and the ICPS, to be in stable replenish. And that would be the point where the launch director can give a go for the crews to deploy to the pad. So now that we're talking about a launch attempt, that would be essentially a single go, and that would allow both the closeout crew to deploy to the pad from the VAB area and the flight crew to deploy to the pad from the operations and checkout building. And so that we will probably be focused more on the flight crew headed out to the pad than the closeout crew. And the closeout crew would get there 15-20 minutes before the flight crew, and they would just be, at that point, the closeout crew will be bringing some equipment up in the elevators up to the white room to get ready for the crew, to help the crew get on board Orion. And then the last decision point and the last hold is more of a standard hold, 30 minutes, again, standard planned hold. And that would begin about 40 minutes before the opening of the launch window. And so the idea here is that given a T0 time, you can work backwards to, they would be picking up the clock 10 minutes before that. So that would be 6:14 p.m., T-minus 10 minutes and counting, for a 6:24 p.m. liftoff at the very beginning of the 2-hour launch window. And that 30-minute hold, there are other things going on. If there are any issues they're working, this allows them to catch up on those. But in that hold, probably about 15 minutes, probably in the middle of that hold, they would be the launch director and the launch team would be going through their final polls. There will be, I think, 3 of them. There will be an internal management poll. There's a launch team poll that the NASA test director conducts, and then the final poll is done by the launch director. And we will hear we'll have to see how it goes, but we'll probably start to hear the launch team during that final poll by Artemis launch director Charlie Blackwell Thompson, and which is how we heard it on Artemis 1. The one difference between Artemis 1 and Artemis 2 in terms of what we might hear during the countdown is that the expectation is that when the crew gets into Orion, we would hear that communications loop. So we would hear the crew doing communications checks with the Launch Control Center, and then also Mission Control in Houston. So we would hear that, but we won't necessarily hear, like in Shuttle. That was usually the point where we would start to hear the launch team on the main countdown net loop. I don't think we're going to hear that this time. We're just going to hear the occasional communications with the flight crew. They'll be doing leak checks of the crew cabin, leak checks of the crew's, each individual crew member's suit loops, things like that. Communications checks, we'll hear that. So you'll hear comm checks. Again, testing the integrity of making sure that the suit, each crew member's suit loop is leak tight. And then eventually when they close the Orion hatch, they'll do a couple of leak checks of the crew module to make sure that it is also pressure tight. So we should hear about that. And then again, when we get down into maybe around L-15 minutes, maybe L-20, depends on what's going on. And then also, as we've seen with Artemis I and with the wet dress rehearsal number 2 back on February 19th, they took a little bit of extra time to pick up the clock for that back on February 19th. So it wouldn't be surprising, especially if they're close to being on time, that it will be interesting to see if it's how important it is for them to be ready to launch right at the opening of the window. They don't want to use up too much time, but they also want to make sure this is the first crewed launch of this system. They want to make sure everybody's ready to go. So I wouldn't be surprised if they need to take an extra 5-10 minutes or longer if they're working issues. Then I would not be surprised to see that happen. So anyway, that's a little bit of a preview of what we might see on April 1st. If it's a different date, then all of these times will change because the launch window opens at a different time on April 2nd and April 3rd and so on all the way through April 6th. So then the next sort of news item of the week was this Bloomberg report. Let me see if I have that screen here. I'll put the link to this story in the description. It's not in there right now, but I will update the description of the live stream with this link. And if I use any of the other stories, there's a couple of stories by Marcia Smith from spacepolicyonline.com some of this past week's news. But this is the story that's gotten a lot of discussion since it was released on Thursday, I believe. Yes. So what it's talking about is the idea of changing the lunar landing concept of operations from a lunar orbit rendezvous, which was the plan when the first lunar landing was Artemis III, to an Earth orbit rendezvous for a couple of different reasons. And so let me see if I've got these slides set up. That's not it. This one. So this was the original plan. Starship and SpaceX won the original lunar landing competition. So this was the Appendix H integrated lunar lander competition. It was a 2 rounds. There was an initial cut where you had 3. They narrowed it down, but there were only 3 proposals, and then they down selected to somewhat surprisingly at the time a single source lunar lander proposal, and that was SpaceX won that award. So the concept of operations here uses propellant refilling in low Earth orbit, or maybe just Earth orbit, because there are a couple of different orbits that SpaceX ended up talking about, and it's not totally clear whether they would still use this in the altered proposal. But all of this work has to occur probably weeks before before Orion and SLS would launch the crew to rendezvous with Starship. Again, assuming that they're going to be the ones doing this, because now there's a sort of a mini competition between SpaceX with Starship HLS and Blue Origin with their Blue Moon proposal, but we don't have detailed information about the Blue Moon concept, because they were originally going to be the third lunar landing. SpaceX gets the first two, and then Blue Origin would get the third. But now that they're competing for the first one again, to some extent, some unspecified extent, we don't know whether they can support either Earth orbit rendezvous or lunar orbit rendezvous. But what would happen for SpaceX is that they would have to send Starship HLS from either their final tanking orbit, which is this high elliptical Earth orbit, to the moon, and at that point Starship is no longer is outside of the supply chain of propellant at that point. And then they have to loiter in that gateway orbit, this near rectilinear halo orbit. This was the original plan, for 2 months or possibly up to 3 months. So without any refueling, and that means that they would have to be able to sustain enough fuel to do the flight plan for in this case it was still called Artemis II, which is you stand by until Orion comes and docks with you. 2 of the crew transfer to Starship. Starship goes down, lands on the moon, and then returns with those 2 crew all the way back to the gateway orbit. And so that obviously requires a decent amount of fuel. So the alternative proposal would be more like this is the Blue Moon, their architecture, and it just as an aside, it also requires a significant amount of refueling. It's just they're not proposing this now, is what we understand. But what this story is suggesting is something like what Constellation did in terms of their concept of operations, which is again an Earth orbit rendezvous. In the case of Constellation, they were just talking about a dual launch, so 2 launches. So first their bigger launch vehicle, again, these were just paper launch vehicles, so these were never completely designed. I don't think either of these got through critical design review. But the Ares 5 vehicle would launch the lunar lander with the Earth departure stage, and then Orion would launch an Ares 1 rendezvous in low Earth orbit, and then the Earth departure stage would make the translunar injection burn, and then the lunar lander would make the lunar orbit insertion burn. That's what LOI is here. And then Orion would loiter in low lunar orbit, and you can see over here this is this sort of reference orbit, which is 100 kilometers circular. Then after the lunar lander goes down with the surface crew, they do the surface operations. It comes back. Again, whether it's an ascent stage, whether it's a multi-stage lander or not, it returns the crew back to low lunar orbit. Orion, whether or not Orion is the active docking vehicle, the rendezvous would be done by the lunar lander, and then whether Orion does the final approach and docking is sort of irrelevant. The crew transfers back to Orion, and then Orion does basically its only large burn of this concept of operations, which is the trans-Earth injection burn from low lunar orbit back to this Earth return trajectory. It's a direct return, direct re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. And again, we've as they've been talking about, you can do, in this case too, you can either do a direct or a skip re-entry with the Orion's systems. But this is also suggestive again that when Orion was originally designed for Constellation, it supports this Earth orbit rendezvous concept of operations. So the thing is that SLS can support launching Orion either into low Earth orbit or to the moon. So SLS can support the Earth orbit rendezvous. It's essentially over designed to support Earth orbit rendezvous, and that would essentially be what they're doing on the new Artemis III, which is just a low Earth orbit rendezvous and docking test. But it can also support lunar orbit rendezvous, and we just saw on Artemis I, even with the ICPS being right on the edge of the performance to get Orion to do a translunar injection burn with Orion, it demonstrated that on Artemis I. But the problem for Starship and SpaceX right now is once it is stocking the Starship lander with enough propellant to loiter around the moon for up to 3 months. And so how this accelerates that plan is it reduces the number of tankers needed to do that. And there are other benefits from a concept of operations standpoint. It doesn't just eliminate the loiter, it also eliminates and reduces the number of tankers, but it also increases the launch opportunities for this Earth orbit rendezvous and docking. Again, if we're making the assumption it is a low Earth orbit rendezvous, then that's the case. Interestingly, so one of the things I'd heard about this idea maybe about 3 months ago. And at the time they talked about doing it as perhaps a high Earth orbit rendezvous. And that would be interesting. But one of the things that they talked about going all the way back 6 years ago when they did this original scrub of the concept of operations, because they wanted at the time to do this lunar landing by the end of 2024. Let me see if I can find that slide. So this is something that the one of the divisions within the then Exploration Directorate, it was, I think, called differently at the time. It was a merged directorate between human spaceflight operations and exploration. I think it was called Human Exploration and Operations or something like that, HEO Mission Directorate, and that's subsequently been subdivided. But you can see here one of the things in terms of their evaluation of doing a high Earth orbit. So if you look here in this chart, so this is talking about a prox ops, and this is what they ended up doing for Artemis II. It's a demonstration of proximity operations, and it gives you a handling qualities demonstration. But then the other one here was doing a full rendezvous and docking in, again, HEO, high Earth orbit. And so what was interesting is at the time, and this is a long time ago now, especially in space years, they talked about a couple of risks to that, being that there's not a lot of operational experience doing rendezvous in a highly elliptical orbit. There may be opportunity constraints, availability constraints that might end up being. It will be interesting to see if that's the case. And so one of those details here that I don't know that the story necessarily is explicit about was whether they're talking about a low Earth orbit rendezvous where you're trying to launch into an orbit that is more or less circular, versus a high Earth orbit, versus launching and rendezvousing in a high Earth orbit. And let me see if I can find that. There's a graphic of this proposed final tanking orbit. Again, this may not be what they would be talking about, but So this is an example of a Starship quote unquote final tanking orbit. So again, these are just concepts. We don't know at this point whether these are what exactly the concept is, and this is why it would be interesting from a detail standpoint to know. But this was the idea that they were talking about for a final tanking orbit concept. Now it's possible, if you don't have to worry about loiter, that you don't need to do something this, I guess, extreme, so to speak, extreme in air quotes. But doing a rendezvous from the ground to that orbit might be a little trickier. And so it may also be possible as a compromise, so that you get all of the benefits of fewer tanker launches for Starship, zero loiter, higher launch availability, is to pick a higher circular Earth orbit, but not this high. That might be, it might be 300, maybe 300 nautical miles or something higher than that, because the circular parking orbits that they talked about for Apollo, for instance, and they were also talking about for exploration upper stage, were a parking orbit of about 100 nautical miles. And so that's a little low from a lifetime standpoint. It's fine as a parking orbit, but you would probably want to go a little higher than that. But then there are trade-offs in terms of micrometeor, MMOD, orbital debris. So there's a lot of things to talk about here, but just in terms of sort of initial takeaways from this concept, because the story, what's valuable, one of the things that's valuable about the story, there's several things that are valuable about it. One of them is that it confirms this concept that we'd heard about a few months ago, that not only that this was the acceleration plan that they were talking about, but also some of the details of it. But one of the takeaways, or one of the questions that comes out of this, is what's the chicken and what's the egg? Because the reporting is talking about, there's more of an emphasis, at least in the headline, about taking the translunar injection burn away from SLS. And so there's that. So the question kind of becomes, which is the chicken and which is the egg? So taking the TLI burn away from SLS, what you're effectively doing is you no longer need you don't necessarily need an upper stage for SLS at that point. You can get Orion into a low Earth orbit for sure without just using the core stage and boosters. And so you're marginalizing the capability even more. So it went from being a general purpose launcher to just an Orion crew launch vehicle. It's essentially a big, well, that's not totally fair, but it was a lunar crew launch vehicle, as we saw demonstrated on Artemis I, just it was an uncrewed demo of that crewed lunar transport system. And now we're talking about, now you don't need the upper stage. Now you don't need to go to the moon. You just need something that can get this 27 metric ton, crew capable, lunar capable spacecraft just into low Earth orbit. That's something that could be done by there are other launchers that can do that, like Falcon Heavy. Now, integrating Orion with those is a non-trivial task, but setting that aside, it does essentially, there's a sort of a chicken and egg here, because that's one part of the story, but how does that accelerate Starship development? It doesn't really. What does accelerate Starship development or compress their schedule or reduce the amount of work that they need to do to be ready to fly Artemis IV is it reduces the number of tankers that they need to launch. It reduces it. I mean, that's basically what it is they're still going to need to do refueling, but it can be done in a much more optimal way. You might be able to cut be able to cut the number of refuelings by a significant amount. And then that just means that your tanker campaign is much shorter, and it just allows more flexibility in terms of synchronizing Starship launches and tanker launches with the SLS and Orion ground processing that needs to be done to get it ready to launch. So there is some value in that, but it doesn't, just like it doesn't, we don't know about the SLS production that needs to be accelerated to get that fourth SLS vehicle ready for Artemis IV. We also don't know whether the acceleration of HLS, the Starship HLS, is going to happen. So the question is, so then the second question is, what's the guaranteed benefit out of this? You're not guaranteed that you're going to accelerate SLS production. You're not guaranteed that you're going to accelerate the HLS schedule. But by changing to an Earth orbit rendezvous concept of operations, you no longer need SLS. And so you can, if you can go to Earth orbit rendezvous, then you can retire SLS, guaranteed, regardless of the outcome of any of this. And so it gets back to this even bigger picture question of what's more important here, the race with China or the long-term sustainability. And going into last year, the White House was on the side of long-term sustainability, and Congress was on the side of the race with China. So the thing is that this doesn't necessarily guarantee that we're going to win the race, if we being the United States, but it is a step in the direction that the White House wants to go for long-term sustainability, because it is part of the plan, which is to retire SLS, which gives you back that $2 billion or more pie wedge in the budget. Whether that's, that might not be until the very end of the decade, but it is a goal of the administration to do that. So there's a lot of things going on here. But it is very interesting, because it does indicate it is a path that could be taken. And of course, we're going to have to see if this is ever confirmed, or how we find out if this is confirmed either from NASA or from Congress, or from, during by a NASA official during congressional testimony. It will be interesting to see how this comes out and what comes of this. But these are all of the considerations. It isn't just, these things down here are not just financial considerations, they're also political considerations. And so there's more to this than just SpaceX and Boeing as well. And so the thing is that now that Exploration Upper Stage is canceled, and that Boeing was prime on that, all that Boeing is going to get at this point is just core stage production. And if they're going to retire SLS anyway, then you're basically capping SLS production in theory, especially if the White House chooses to pick Artemis V as the new retirement date. Then Boeing is finishing the third core stage, and they would basically need to finish two more before they're done. And so that's the only issue there is as I was talking about in a few of the past streams, SLS may end up being kind of a bridge capability. And so it's just a question of whether Congress wants there to be a gap in capability between SLS and the commercial lunar, and a commercial lunar alternative, because we don't know when that is going to be available. If it either New Glenn, either Blue Origin and New Glenn, or one of the commercial launchers launching Orion into Earth orbit and doing it that way, or going with a lunar orbit rendezvous architecture and some other launcher, perhaps New Glenn, or something else. You could certainly combine all of those together. You could do like a constellation style Earth orbit rendezvous, or you could do the Starship style Earth orbit rendezvous, where in that case, Starship is both the Earth departure stage and the lunar lander. So it is interesting. It is interesting. It's interesting and something we're going to be following certainly for the next couple of years, because even as we talk here, they have maybe 2 years to launch Artemis 2, 3, and 4. And if they're going to launch Artemis 4 in early 2028, as I've said a couple of times now, you're having to stretch definition of terms pretty good to call April or May early 2028 or early whatever year. So, for instance, we're starting to stretch the definition of early 2026 for Artemis 2 at this point. So we will have to see, but we will have to see how this goes. And so again, it's the benefits of this there are some benefits of this in terms of reducing the amount of time, reducing the amount of tankers, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee the outcome that people are looking for, which is the actual lunar landing by this time 2 years from now. So let me see if there's anything. And then I think, let me just take a quick look here at the time. What I'll do is there's, let me make sure that this is up here. There were a couple of other developments in terms of we heard from European Space Agency. We heard that NASA has the international partners coming to Washington. I think it's Washington, to talk about the new Artemis plan. We don't really have a lot of details. The Europeans didn't really. They were asked about Gateway, and I know that the NASA leadership did an appearance. I think it was at the Lunar Planetary Conference. They were asked about Gateway. Both of them were asked about Gateway, and they really didn't talk about anything. But we're certainly hearing rumors about negotiations. And the thing is, if this is the U.S. plan for Artemis going forward, are they willing to? How much of a negotiation is it? And I guess we will find out. It is possible, again, looking at some of the other U.S. International dynamics between the U.S. government and foreign governments, again, foreign from the point of view of the United States, certainly wonder if this is kind of a take it or leave it type of thing. So I don't know how much, if there is any leverage left, or whether the United States is going to just do what it wants to do, regardless of what the international partners are going to say. Because I don't know what exactly can the international partners, what leverage do they have? Because they're making the European service module, but they can, anything that they would do with the Gateway modules is going to require redesigns at this point. Now that Exploration Upper Stage and Mobile Launcher 2 are whether they're officially canceled at this point, it sounds like work on them has been either suspended or they're going to start reversing work on that before they're officially terminated. So in theory, you could always go back and undo the stuff that you undid, but there's, I think, one of those questions, if you're just talking about it from a historical standpoint or a legal standpoint, is have we already gone past the point of no return with the decision to cancel Exploration Upper Stage and Mobile Launcher 2? And it sounds like, if not now, very soon. And so, it's hard to see who's going to changed their mind at this point. So that's kind of where we are on that. We're still waiting for more details. Maybe we will hear something from one of the parties about what they're going to do as an alternative to Gateway, but we can see the U.S. plan. The U.S. plan does not discuss using Gateway in any way, shape, or form. So what's the value in continuing that for the U.S.? It still doesn't seem like it's a part of the plan. And then we still also have the question about the other SLS upgrade, the upgraded solid rocket boosters. Still haven't heard anything about that either. But we certainly have a lot of time to hear about that the rest of this year. So I'll go back to the live shot. This is a wide shot of the vehicle at pad 39B. But let me go ahead and go back and look for some questions in here. So the question, we got this question in the NSF NASA spaceflight live stream. I don't remember whether I said the other thought. So I think based on what we saw with the hydrogen leaks, seeing the hydrogen leaks again with this vehicle, I would say makes me a little bit I guess the diplomatic way of putting it is it sort of, for me, puts me back in my expectations are kind of back to where they were for Artemis I, which is I kind of feel like there's sort of a 50-50 chance on any particular launch attempt that they're going to go. And so, but I think to put a finer point on it, it really just comes down to, let's see what happens during tanking. So I think if they get through tanking like they did in the second wet dress rehearsal with no leaks, and the crews go out to the pad and they get on board, I think the chances go from 50-50, they get better. It, of course, depends on what's going on, for instance, with the weather on that day. But I think that the chances go from sort of a generic 50-50 for this vehicle to would increase. It's really based to a great degree on what happens during tanking. So that's, we'll see. It'll be a combination of is the vehicle still leak tight and the weather, and then does anything else come up technically on launch day? So, but I think that's kind of the way I'm looking at it going into this next tanking and first launch attempt. Is I think there's a decent chance that they're going to have enough time to be ready to make that attempt on April 1st. Pardon me. But what happens is, I think, hard. It's hard to say until you have even a few minutes of hindsight. If they get through liquid hydrogen fast fill on the core stage smoothly, and they're still seeing low hydrogen concentrations, I think we said a lot during that second wet dress rehearsal. You're never going to see zero. If you see zero, then it causes you to wonder if the detector is working correctly. But as long as it is within the same range as they were seeing the first time, I think they will be comfortable with, less than 1% or 1.5%. I think they saw as a max on the second wet dress rehearsal. If they're seeing 5, 10, if they're getting up into the double digit percentages, that's probably, it will be a little bit more of a nail biter, a little more of a white knuckle launch attempt at that point, I would think. And we would just have to see what they decide to do. But hopefully we will get a little bit more of a real-time read on what they're seeing during the launch attempt. So the expectation being we're going to have live commentary beginning with when tanking starts. And so again, I was let me go and pull up that speculative slide for April 1st, but just to give you an idea again about the timings. So I'm not sure that they're going to begin live commentary at 5:49 a.m. for a 6:24 p.m. launch, but that would be I'll certainly be considering it when we get to launch day, to be ready to live stream at that point, because that to me is like that's when things begin. It's like that's when you start the pregame show, is when the tanking meeting starts. And actually the tanking meeting might start a few minutes before the clock stops. So it might be, again, a few minutes, like it might be 5:45 a.m. that they begin the tanking meeting. But at any rate, we should have live commentary throughout the tanking and then into the sort of more formal launch attempt. And again, if you look at it here, the crew's not necessarily going to be going out to the pad until early afternoon. So, but again, as we saw for both wet dress rehearsals, the morning and the tanking during the morning is going to be critical to watch in terms of, are they going to be ready to make a launch attempt on, even if they start into tanking, are they going to be able to make a launch attempt on April 1st? I think the reporting is, and again, this question was probably this question may have been before I got to it. I do think the reporting is reliable. It is, as I said, it's something that I heard a version of, and if you recall in the NASA Inspector General report, they mentioned this in a section that they had to add, basically because it was somewhat post. Well, no, I guess it was during their audit period. But what they mentioned was that these acceleration approaches that NASA solicited from both SpaceX and Blue Origin were due in December, and I heard it closer to that time frame. But the problem is it's just a single source, so I don't know. This Bloomberg essentially is confirming that report, I would say. So I do think that the reporting is trustworthy. It's just, again, how you view how you interpret what that is. So I didn't hear it in terms of the source that I heard it from didn't talk about the consequences of it, but those are really important, especially looking now at what we're looking at now, which is given that they've canceled the SLS upgrades, or certainly the core SLS upgrade, you have to wonder now if marginalizing SLS is a side effect of the acceleration approach, it's hard not to view it as something that fits in with the overall White House plan. Again, we will find out perhaps in the next week or so if their budget request is released, not this coming week, or if your week begins on Sunday, not this week of the 22nd or 23rd of March, but next week, the week of March, either March 29th or March 30th. We may see the budget released, perhaps either on the day of the Artemis II launch attempt, or on the eve, or maybe, again, sometime during next week. That would give us confirmation or clarification on what the White House plan is now. But again, given some of these things, it's hard not to wonder, given what the plan was last year, which was to cancel all the government programs after Artemis III, or basically after 2027. If that's how much that's been modified. And it may just be that they just have scratched out Artemis III and then written in Artemis V now. So. And it is interesting. if you were to go with this, then in theory, you could, if you were to go with an Earth orbit rendezvous. I think that, again, the details. That's why the details are important, though, because if you're talking about let's say a circular orbit of Starship of, and again, I'm setting aside the MMOD micrometeoroid orbital debris issue, which you can't for real, but let's just set it aside for a second. If the rendezvous orbit were, let's say, 1,000 nautical miles circular, then you need some additional performance for Orion, because you still have to reserve the performance for Orion to do the trans-Earth injection burn. And so maybe you still need an upper stage to do, to do perhaps even a couple of burns, or just take care of an initial rendezvous burn, a large phasing burn, or a large, either an NC burn or an NH burn, and talking about things like that, and because you're trying to protect Orion's capability to do the trans-Earth injection burn from low lunar orbit, but also to have some margin there, and perhaps also to have some abort capability. So again, that's where the details are important. So if you're talking about a rendezvousing with Starship in an orbit of 100 nautical miles circular, then you don't necessarily need an upper stage, I don't think, or maybe 200, or whatever. I don't know the International Space Station orbit off the top of my head, but maybe it's possible, if it's low enough, that you don't necessarily need. But it also may be possible that you would want it, again, also for the margins on the front end, that you get an upper stage. It still only gives you, if you're talking about ICPS or even Centaur 5, I don't know that the lives of those are much greater than, maybe for ICPS is probably less than 8 hours, and for Centaur 5 it's probably still, I would imagine, not much more than, again, it might be significantly less than 24 hours, but still that doesn't give you, that only gives you a little bit of margin in terms of performing the rendezvous maneuvers that you need to perform, to protect the long-term return capability for Orion from low lunar orbit in that Earth orbit rendezvous concept of operations. But it is kind of tantalizing that maybe this does really truly have bigger implications, because it would, if it did have the implication of eliminating the upper stage capability you can certainly, from a kludge standpoint, and just as a workaround, so that you can fly, that you have the possibility of flying these 4 missions, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in less than 3 years, that it keeps that option on the table. So then the problem for, because time is the highest priority, is being able to do it again before the end of this presidential term. There's a question about how much it would cost to integrate Orion with another launch vehicle, not just cost but also time. Can that be done in? I mean, you have Artemis IV is either 2 years from now or less than 2 years from now, and so could you have Orion ready to fly on another vehicle, on another launch vehicle, in less than 2 years? I mean, perhaps given enough money, but I mean, that's the other exercise here, is part of this exercise is to minimize not just time but also cost, and so there will be some conflict between the two, and they will probably have to pick one or the other at some point. But I don't know that they have the money to do that right now. And so if you're going to use the SLS, regardless of whether it's over designed for this or not, it might still be the fastest way to fly those next missions. But again, you also have the caveat of, can Boeing finish the fourth and fifth core stage builds in time to do those as well? So I think, again, really, if you look at the sequence, here's the Artemis II vehicle on the pad, perhaps only a week and a half. It's close to launch ready right now. The Artemis III SLS and Orion will probably be ready in the next year. It would need to be faster than that if they want to fly on the schedule they're talking about for the new Artemis III. But the tough one from a schedule standpoint is Artemis IV. So if you're flying beginning of 2028 and end of 2028, that's roughly a year's worth of time. But Artemis III is middle of 27 and Artemis IV is early 2028. That's much less than a year's worth of time. It's just a question of how much less. Is it 9 months? Is it 6 months? But that's the one that's going to be the toughest for everybody to make it for. So not just not just the lunar landers, but also Orion and SLS is having the Artemis III production done this year or within the next year, and then having another build done in the next much less than a year. They'll need to have that for the Artemis IV, and so how they're going to do that is to be announced, I guess. Right. So yes, and so one of the things mentioned here, one of those things that they were talking about, or that they'd flagged all the way back in Constellation, was the eyeballs out for that docked Earth departure stage. Let me see if I can bring that. So you have the crew. You have the over here. You have the Earth departure stage firing in from left to right, and the crew is facing towards the stage. So they're being pushed. It's in theory an eyeballs out thrust. And so the question, that was something that had been flagged as something to continue to look at. And you would need to do that if you're talking about a docked burn with Starship, you'd be looking at something similar to that. So the question is the due diligence on that. But it isn't. It doesn't mean that it's a showstopper. It's just something that they wanted to, that had been flagged as something that they needed to keep taking a look at. And right, and then the other, again, having those forces through, applied to Orion in a differently than thrust from its main engine. Is it, or thrust for that matter from ICPS, or thrust from core stage and solid rocket boosters too. So yes, but yeah, those are things that'll need to be. But again, it would be, again, in terms of in the name of details, it would be interesting to know in 6 months what are the biggest, maybe not showstoppers, but what are the issues what are the highest priority issues to deal with in terms of getting ready for Artemis IV. And so in theory, if they were going to go with this concept of operations of an Earth orbit rendezvous between Starship and Orion, you could test doing a docked burn. This is again something that going back to the Apollo 9 experience, where they, for to minimize risks for the first lunar module mission and all of the test objectives on Apollo 9. This is the D mission. They did do, I believe, one of the test objectives was doing docked burns between the lunar module and the command module. And so they, I believe, did a I don't know if they did an ascent propulsion system burn, but they did do a descent propulsion system. I think it's descent propulsion system, but they did a docked burn with using the descent propulsion system engine, the descent stage main engine. And so again, if Starship participates, it would obviously, if Starship is going to be the lunar lander for 4, I think it almost becomes mandatory that it be ready to do Artemis 3. But that would give you an opportunity to do a docked burn test, and perhaps maybe at a lower throttle setting, just to get some data on it. And so you could do data. Perhaps you could do a low throttle burn. And again, it would be interesting to see again what's a duration you would need to see to get enough data to then either extrapolate from that to higher thrust. If you're not sure how high of a throttle setting you could live with. Again, again, I'm not the Starship guy, but if I recall correctly, the sea level engines are the ones that can be throttled versus the vacuum engines. But again, I don't know what the not just throttled, but I think also gimbaled. But But again, this is going to be the new version 3 version of the Starship, so we'll have to see what happens with that too as well. But it seems like it would be an option and the type of test objective that you might want to include in Artemis 3 if you're going to do this type of Earth orbit rendezvous concept of operations, would be to do a docked burn test where the lunar lander is making the burn. And you might want to do that not just with Starship, but also with the Blue Moon lunar lander. Even if you weren't necessarily looking at doing Earth orbit rendezvous, it still might be something that you would want to get some data on. Right. So just looking at some of the comments here. Yeah. So then, again, we don't know what the Blue Origin acceleration proposal is and whether it could support Earth orbit rendezvous or not. So I'm just looking for questions. It would result in fewer tanker launches because the amount of fuel is, or really the amount of mass, Orion's mass relative to Starship. Relative to the Starship mass is not that significant, especially if you're talking about 60 to 90 days of boil off as well. So that's, I think the idea is it would reduce. You might need to have more propellant at the start, but you can adjust the launch of Orion so that it happens after immediately after, within, give or take hours or a day or so. But you could, if you wanted to, you could adjust the Orion launch so that to minimize the possible amount of boil off. So it would be a handful of days, because Orion would rendezvous and dock with Starship probably in is probably something like a 24-hour rendezvous. So you have a couple of days there, then you do the TLI burn. It's going to be a fast transfer, so to speak. So it would be, it might be as few as 3 days. You're going to do a lunar orbit insertion burn relatively quickly, if not the first day, within the first 24 hours. So you're going to get to a lunar landing, to that whole, descent, orbit insertion, powered descent. You're going to get to that within a week versus having to loiter in lunar orbit for, again, as many as 90 days, but minimum 60 days. And so the question is, how much boil off can you get? And then you don't have to worry about loitering even in Earth orbit either. So. Right, and then that's another savings as well. Is, again, your ascent to rendezvous with Orion is, you only have to go back up to 100 kilometers circular versus the going back to the gateway orbit, which it isn't so much the time, but it does require more. It's possible that the ascent just back to low lunar orbit is more, but it is still a significant amount of delta V required to get from low lunar orbit up to the near rectilinear halo orbit. But, again, in terms of trade-offs, we don't know if they were going to go with a lunar orbit rendezvous. It's unlikely, I would say, at this point. I guess it's still a possibility that they would use the gateway orbit, which was sort of the baseline for Artemis III, but I'd say there's a decent chance they're going to try some other type of staging orbit, if there is one, for the lunar lander to loiter in, for Orion to go chase down, if they do stick with the lunar orbit rendezvous. And so, yeah, at least as far as we know, if there was a capability, if the Starship supply chain could be extended out to the moon at this point, then it would reduce the burden. It would put the burden on the supply chain. But if you could get tankers out to the gateway orbit, for instance, then you could just replenish the lunar lander as needed during that loiter time while they're waiting for SLS and Orion to get ready to fly. But because of that, so then the flip side of it is, since the lunar lander isn't going to be cannot be resupplied in lunar orbit, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to salvage it. That they will end up likely disposing of it and sending it out to a heliocentric orbit, or you could dispose of it on the surface of the moon as well. You just crash it. We saw Apollo do on some missions deorbit, crash on the moon, and some missions heliocentric. Just heliocentric disposal. And so it is, I guess, you guys are talking about, again, I'm catching up, but you guys are talking about different refueling concepts. So if you look at the, interestingly, the Blue Origin, their full Mark II architecture would not leave a depot in lunar orbit, it would send that cislunar transporter. The refueler would just cycle back and forth between lunar orbit and Earth orbit. Let me go pull up that. I think I had that. Nope, that's not it. Well, what it is, but it's. So this is the again the full Mark II concept of operations. This was again when this was the old Artemis V, the third lunar landing. So you have and they had their version of a final tanking orbit, which they called a stair-step orbit. So this is the cislunar transporter, I guess. So they launch the transporter first, they refuel it, then they launch the lander. It's refueled a couple of times. As you can see, it's refueled in low Earth orbit, and then it's refueled again in the stair-step orbit, and then the lander goes to the moon. But then I'm sorry. So the lander gets one refueling, and then it goes to the moon. But then the transporter is refueled multiple times, and then it goes to the moon. Now this is their first lunar landing mission, and so they're looking at disposing of the transporter as well for that first lunar landing mission. For SpaceX, they don't indicate. So they either don't or weren't willing to indicate what they were going to do with the Starship. But I don't know what the alternatives will be, because they will eventually run out of the capability of sustaining or doing propulsion. So I don't know where you would put it when it no longer can station keep or maintain, or do orbital maintenance or station keep, or attitude maintenance or anything. It may still have its systems may still work, but eventually you would need to send something to it if you were going to try to reuse it, basically. So again, in terms of shortening the schedule for Starship readiness, the idea is, again, by reducing the delta V requirements, you are reducing the delta V requirements. You're reducing the delta V requirements, and then also the boil off losses, which is essentially also reducing the delta V requirements. So you're doing a direct, and this is something that the Starship's uncrewed lunar landing demo was going to do. So even before we'd heard that they weren't going to do a full crewed Artemis III demo. They weren't going to first go to the gateway orbit and then go to low lunar orbit. They were going to go directly from Earth orbit to, do TLI, do a lunar orbit insertion directly into low lunar orbit, and then do the landing, and then they're done. So again, that reduces the number of tankers necessary to fly. And again, it's just a question of when does Starship turn the corner? Because eventually, when they've got their launch cadence and when they're flying it at a high frequency, maybe not reaching maybe not getting all the way to where Falcon is right now, but if they were launching maybe on a weekly basis already at that point, but that may be what they're looking at, which is how frequently do they need to be launching? And again, they're going to have at least 2 launch pads should be operational by that point. The new one at Starbase, and then the one at 39A, and they may have also reactivated the original launch pad at Starbase, and perhaps again it's not clear when Launch Complex 37 will be operational for Starship, but they'll be able to they'll at least and so that's the thing, is when are they going to have, what level of capability and launch cadence are they going to be able to demonstrate in the next 2 years from where they are right now? And so I think again, this concept reduces the number of launches that they need to do. And if it so happens that they turn the corner in the next year or so and they have a much higher launch rate, then that just makes it, again, that gives them margin over whatever they need to do. It gives them, but I think the idea is trying to improve the chances of being able to do the lunar landing this way versus not necessarily being confident that they're going to be able to do the baseline lunar landing plan with that 60 to 90 day loiter in lunar orbit without any possibility of refueling when you leave the Earth. So yeah, this will reduce the number of launches, and in theory get them to the level of capability. They'll get to the level of capability to support this Earth orbit rendezvous concept of operations sooner, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get there in the next 2 years. And again, to be fair, we don't know at this point all of the programs. We don't have enough detail from any of the programs at this point to know for sure if they're going to be ready to fly Artemis 4 2 years from now or not. Again, as I was saying, you've got the question about delivering those Artemis 4, all of the Artemis 4 Orion and SLS hardware in the time period needed for that. And then on top of that, you also now have the Centaur 5 integration with SLS that you need to do in less than 2 years. You have the lunar landers that we've been talking about, the demonstrations they need to do, the flights that they need to make, and perhaps. And again, we don't know we don't know specifically where the spacesuits are. I guess if you were just looking at the landscape right now, it kind of seems like the Axiom space, the AX EMUs have a less ambitious path to being ready to fly, to having units ready for a early 2028 lunar landing. But there are still questions about all of them, not just, take your pick. It isn't just questions about the lunar landers. It's questions about Orion and SLS production as well. So it's just they have different things that they need to accomplish in the next 2 years, but there's quite a bit for everybody to do, especially for the Artemis 4 build, because you've got, again, that time crunch between 3 and 4. For launch, if we're talking about Artemis II, if that's the question from Token Joy about how many consecutive days in a row for launch attempts, I think they're going to probably be limited by the launch team's capabilities and all of the support team's capabilities to turn around 2-3 days in a row. But let me see if I can find that chart. It's not much to look at, but it still has the illustration on it. I guess it would be over here. But the short answer is that they have the capability, all things considered, to make 4 launch attempts in 6 days, and so that fits neatly into this launch period 19. Maybe I can find it. And I'm having trouble finding it. But that is the short answer. So that would work out to, I just can't, there it is. Yikes. Let's see if it'll come up over here. Yeah, not much to look at, but still. So the idea would be, so for Artemis 1, they had the capability to make a maximum of 3 attempts in 7 days. Now for Artemis 2 down here, they have the second liquid hydrogen sphere. So then it becomes more of the constraints are more about the ability for the people to recycle 3 days in a row. So again, we'd heard back at the time that they were activating the second liquid hydrogen sphere, that just purely based on cryogenic commodities, that they could do 3 launch attempts in a row. So 1, 2, in this case, it would be 1, 2, 3 would be here on the 3rd day. But what would happen is again, if these are the launch attempts numbered, but this would be, since we have 6 days, we have 6 days of launch opportunities in April 1st through April 6th. So again, setting aside the important issue of what's going to cause you to scrub 3 times in 4 days, whether if you had weather that bad, that would be not unprecedented, but would be close. If you have a technical issue, what technical issues could you have that would not cause there to be a little bit more of a pause between launch attempts? But setting that aside, this would basically be April 1st, April 2nd for the second attempt, April 4th for the third attempt, and then April 6th would be the end of the launch period. But so again, if this lined up that way, and it doesn't necessarily do that, you might, so for instance, you had something happen on the first launch attempt where you needed an additional day, you might be able to push the second and third attempts together instead, and have one, instead of going April 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 6th, maybe you could go April 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 6th, or something like that. And it'll just, to some extent, will just depend on how when they get to that point, if for instance you've had weather, if weather has stopped you 2 times in a row, what you're willing to do to sort of come back and turn around and try and do that 3rd attempt or the 4th attempt, for instance. So, but that's the capability that they should have at this point. I just got to find my place again. Let me do this here while I remember. Right, and so I don't know if it was the GAO or perhaps even the Inspector General report that just came out maybe 10 days ago, or maybe it was a couple weeks ago, but relatively recently. But yeah, they would have whether they would have two launch pads so that there would be a launch off of either of them. They would have a combined launch cadence of about once a week, or whether that would be three or however many pads it would be, but it would in theory be more than. You would at least have one pad at Starbase and one pad, and have the 39A pad at Kennedy Space Center or Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. So so if you're just asking about, we're just concentrating on the early April. I can bring up the other one, but yeah, this is what they have. This is what they have for launch period 19, and this is actually part of the next launch period 20. But again, in terms of messaging, they're basically saying there is no May doesn't exist until it has to exist. But this April 30th opportunity would be part of launch period 20, and there would be additional opportunities in launch period 20 in May, but they don't want to talk about that. They only want to talk about April. And so we're really just focused on these dates. And if for whatever reason they couldn't make it and we're going to stay out at the pad, where we get back into this whole contingency pad access thing and resetting the flight termination system, we will see. But they don't want to talk about that unless they have to. So, and for the time being, I think everybody's focused on for the first 6 days of the month. And they have, as you can see here, they have 6 days in a row. They have 2-hour launch windows on all 6 days in a row. But the reason that I talked about the scrub turnaround capability is because that's going to limit them more than the celestial mechanics or the Orion constraints, like an eclipse constraint or some of these other things. That's going to the scrub turnaround capability is going to be more of a constraining factor for this first week of April. But then once you get after that, then you get into celestial mechanics, because they could do another launch attempt after that fourth one in 6 days. They could recycle and be ready to do additional launch attempts sooner than April 30th, purely from a cryogenic storage capability on the ground. It's just after the 6th, they're going to have to wait until April 30th. Oh, lost my place. Okay, found it sort of. Right, and that's kind of that is a rhetorical question. How long until Starship is crew rated? And to be fair, same thing with I think Blue Origin eventually envisions a crew transport as a part of their lunar systems as well. Whether they opt to go with Orion and Lockheed Martin as a part of a commercial offering, whether they choose to partner with Lockheed Martin and Orion, or whether they choose to develop their own, it's certainly a question. For Starship, we at least know what they wanted. We already know that they plan to crew rate Starship. It's just a question of, we don't know. We don't have as clear of a development path, and because it's private development, it's probably not necessarily going to be laid out ahead of time what their criteria will be for crew rating. But in theory, NASA will have to certify these commercial replacements for either SLS and or Orion. So we will at least hear NASA officially certify them. I don't know that we're necessarily going to hear all of the criteria or be able to follow the reviews. It'll essentially be a black box from the outside. And so, right, the question is when will that? And yes, as I say that all the time, the big question is when. And so that's going to be the question for, again, readiness for Artemis 4. Will they be ready by early 2028? When will the replacement? When will the if they're going to replace SLS as the Orion launcher? When will that capability be ready? Because this is the case of, it's sort of like the Centaur 5 with SLS case. So SLS will have flown a couple of times with a different upper stage. Centaur 5 will have flown half a dozen more times with another launch with a different booster. But putting them together and certifying that they can fly together, that they're compatible, and making whatever changes are necessary to make them compatible is a question of when. It might not be. I guess we're assuming that it isn't a question of if, that there isn't some sort of a showstopper there, but then it's still a question of when, because it's not necessarily, we have not heard the details of the certification plan and what parts of that they need to do and what parts of it they don't need to do, essentially. For instance, structural testing or wind tunnel testing, or some of the things that I was noting in a video recently. Will they be able to certify without performing some of those tests just by analysis, by existing models or modified computational models? Oh, I lost it again. Shoot. And I that is one of the things that that SpaceX has said qualitatively, is that once they've reached a higher launch cadence, that they'll demonstrate the reliability of the system through not just the number of launches, but the refinements that they need to make to the system in order to launch that often. Again, as we're seeing with Falcon 9. So that's part of it. But then that's still a question of when they're going to reach a cadence that reach some of these different milestones we've seen for Falcon 9, because Falcon 9 went through its own gates in terms of reaching different launch cadences, but also somewhat of an apples to oranges comparison, even if the talent within SpaceX is shifting from Falcon and Dragon to Starship. I think the focus, and we may have already passed that, but it does seem like there's a concerted shift in focus now to focus on Starship. And so we will see how quickly that bears fruit, because it isn't just the system and demonstrating the system, but also, again, the launch cadence is extremely important to the stated company goals. So Centaur 5 is the upper stage of the Vulcan vehicle. I wonder if I have that, or if I can. I wonder if I have that PDF here or not. I wonder if I can bring it up relatively quickly in a. Let's see how hard is it to bring this up. maybe not too hard. Okay, and then I need to go once, twice, kind of. So it is this stage of the Vulcan Centaur launch vehicle. This is just one of those. This is the United Launch Alliance. So it's their next generation upper stage. So SLS, the SLS in space second stage is called the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. It was the Delta IV second stage upper stage. SLS only needs this second stage to fly in space. So, this particular one, there was a SLS specific design called Exploration Upper Stage, which was just canceled because it's late. It's very unlikely to be ready to fly in the next 2.5 to 3 years. And so NASA's looking for an alternative because the Delta IV upper stage, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, is now obsolete. There's the second one is out at the pad. Second one is out at the is this one here out at the pad. It's dwarfed by the rest of the SLS launcher, but there's only this one on the pad, and then there's another unit that's been finished for 3 years now, practically. But then they're out. It's obsolete. They can't build any more of them, so they need something because they want to fly this manifest where they're flying Artemis II now, April 2026, Artemis III mid-2027, Artemis IV early 2028, Artemis V late 2028. And so they need, since the contention is that exploration upper stage might not be ready for even Artemis V, they're looking for something. They're looking for an upper stage that might be ready to fly, especially 4 and 5, because there's no upper stage available to do that. So now again, we have these other things going on where maybe you could get away with flying SLS without an upper stage and using Starship, for instance, to do more of the heavy lifting for a lunar landing mission. So yeah, that's the question about that final tanking orbit. I don't know I think this slide, let me bring it up here. Oh, I was click on the wrong one. This slide had to do with, I think, a concept of operations, or this was for a study for looking at, I guess, possible rendezvous with near-Earth asteroids, I believe. So this is just a study, but they may have taken this data and graphics from the Artemis III concept of operations, at least at one time. So again, as we said, this probably wouldn't be necessary for an Earth orbit rendezvous. This might be required for the lunar orbit rendezvous mission, but it also may be, again, sort of, I don't know about chicken and egg, but just if they can't do this, if they can't make this happen for Artemis IV on the timeline that they're talking about, and they need to go to this Earth orbit rendezvous thing where they're eliminating the loiter, they're eliminating the stop in the gateway orbit, then they might not need this at all for Artemis IV and or Artemis V, depending on who's flying one or the other. It may be that they choose to do this if, for instance, Blue Origin were to fly Artemis IV and then Starship were to fly Artemis V. In that hypothetical, you might still want to do this proposed Earth orbit rendezvous concept. Again, it just depends on what Starship is, when these capabilities are available with Starship. So they did do some. They did do these docked burns, and of course we then saw the same thing with. Although again, I don't think on Apollo 13, so they had to do the dips burn for again, we're going into somewhat into severe trivia, but there was that. There was actually, I don't know if they used the dips for the Apollo 13 accident occurs. They choose to go around the moon and do that PC+2 burn. That may have been done with the lunar module reaction control system, but then they did do a big burn with the dips. And now, again, where were the crew? Some of the crew would have been in the lunar module, if not both. Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes probably were in the lunar module, but it's also possible that Jack Swigert was also in the lunar module. And so you didn't have an eyeballs out test there, but there probably would have been some kind of data collected back on Apollo 9, at least with that crew. So maybe just Rusty Schweikert in the command module, and you have Jim McDivitt and Dave Scott in the lunar module for Apollo 9. But again, you're referring to Gemini 10 and Gemini 11. The Agena engine probably not putting the level of forces that we're talking about here either. Maybe not even for the lunar module docked burn with the command service module, but I think probably also a different order of magnitude for the Starship engines in a docked burn with Orion. Even again with their deep throttling capability, but again, it's that's one of those details that's an interesting detail. And you could also say the same thing for the Blue Origin lander, whether it's this hybrid, whatever this hybrid proposal is for their Artemis IV concept of operations, first lunar landing mission concept of operations, or for their maybe not for the Mark II version, but again, maybe there is a concept out there of using the cislunar transporter to take Orion and other payload from Earth orbit to the moon. There may also be there may be some or a lot of future value in terms of future thinking ahead to the future with Orion to get data on doing doing some eyeballs out type of docked burns and what needs to what do they need to do from an evaluation standpoint or analysis standpoint, and then what do they need to, is there anything they need to do from a operational standpoint? Went by. The reason that they have to wait has to do with the reason they have to wait from April 6th, that if they aren't off the ground by April 6th, then they have to wait until April 30th, has to do with the interim cryogenic propulsion stage and the performance. And so this is something that exploration upper stage would have been a capability gap that exploration upper stage would have closed. In order to give ICPS enough, in order to make a translunar injection burn possible with ICPS, some performance is actually transferred from the core stage to the ICPS. Maybe a better way of putting it is the core stage ends up giving, the core stage ends up making a little bit of the translunar injection burn. Some of the delta V is given to ICPS before it ever starts. And you can see a little bit of that also with the Artemis II trajectory, where in that case, the ICPS is not doing a full translunar injection burn, but it is doing a large percentage of the of the burn necessary, because Orion could not do do a translunar injection burn from low Earth orbit. Does not have the capability to do it. It's on the order of about 3,000 meters per second of capability from a low Earth orbit parking orbit to make a TLI burn. Orion only has about 1,000, give or take. Again, you're setting aside some capabilities for aborts and for dispersions and under variability, but that's because the core stage is doing that performance transfer. You end up with this highly elliptical orbit with a high point of about 2,200 kilometers, and then the low point when they're in the stable orbit, the low point is 185 kilometers or 100 nautical miles. So again, in NASA uses nautical miles for this. So the core stage MECO cutoff insertion orbit is about 1,200 nautical miles by 15 nautical miles, give or take. And then ICPS does a very short burn to raise the periapsis up to 185 kilometers, 100 nautical miles. But because of that, then you can't necessarily make the TLI burn half of the month because of I can show you let me see if I can find that drawing to compare. But it doesn't have enough performance to make a TLI burn from a low Earth orbit circular low Earth orbit of something like 100 nautical miles or 185 kilometers circular. And so that ends up being why I just saw it. Well, that's one of them. Let me see if I can find the side by side. And so definitely in theory, the exploration upper stage would have been able to so this is block 1 with the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. And so you only have the alignments to work for part of because of the equatorial, and it also changes your launch availabilities. When you're doing this from a circular orbit, because the exploration upper stage had the capability to make a full TLI burn from a circular low Earth orbit, again 100 nautical miles, 185 kilometers. You can launch. I think they said that you had a couple of launch opportunities every day. It's just you would still have to pick one or the other, just from a launch team availability standpoint, because the countdowns are so long. It's possible, assuming that Centaur 5 is compatible with SLS, that it has enough performance to give you this part of have enough performance to give you this part of it. Exploration upper stage had enough performance for this, plus the ability to take up to 10 metric tons of additional payload with Orion. So that's a long-winded way of talking about this performance. That's why ICPS has enough performance to send Orion to the moon, but just barely. And again, it needs this extra help from the core stage, versus a more capable stage. But it was also, again, Centaur 5 wasn't available in 2012. Exploration upper stage wasn't available in 2012. It still isn't available today. It might not be available for another 3 years. So this is why they're looking at Centaur 5 now. It's because they need something in less than 2 years. Just trying to catch up in chat here. Let's see. So I guess you could say that nothing is impossible given enough money. So the question being, why can't they restart production of ICPS? It's more of a cost benefit. So again, if money were no option, then in theory you could even if you had none of the tooling remaining, you could spend the money to recreate the ICPS tooling to manufacture the tanks and then do all of the production of all of the systems and all of the elements. But it would be very expensive, and it would take a lot more time than it would probably take more time. It might even take more time at this point than letting EUS finish, for instance. They retired the tooling at least 2 years ago, and I'm not even sure if they maintained the tooling. And they don't necessarily have any place to set up the tooling in Decatur, Alabama, which is where ULA, United Launch Alliance, builds Vulcans now, and that's where they used to build Atlas and Delta vehicles. Actually, I guess they still technically are finishing Atlas production or close to that, retiring it, but they retired Delta production. The last delivery of Delta hardware was actually the last ICPS, the third and final ICPS unit. That was delivered in the summer of 2023. That's almost 3 years ago. But I think they'd said they were going to maintain that tooling until the last Delta IV flew, and that, I believe, was about this time 2 years ago. So the last Delta IV Heavy flew about 2 years ago. Now they're maintaining enough of the, again, this is sort of a question of how obsolete is it, but they do still have to maintain some level of service and maintenance capability for that final interim cryogenic propulsion stage, and also to support launching this element, this one that's on the vehicle out at the pad right now. It's up here. It's basically where between, it's white, at least from this distance, and the Orion fairings are also white, but the part of the ICPS that you can see has the foam over. Foam has been painted white because it's an in-space stage. But anyway, the reason that they quote unquote can't restart it is there are more cost effective or just plain old cheaper options, even if it requires a different type of work than restarting ICPS production. And so, NASA has tentatively chosen Centaur 5. That is in production. It is not obsolete. United Launch Alliance is making those right now. That it's cheaper to make Centaur 5 compatible with SLS than to restart ICPS production. It may not just be NASA, it may be everybody involved. So United Launch Alliance, NASA, and any of the other parties involved in making sure that Centaur and SLS are compatible. There will probably be the question about direct abort capability from the TLI burn. It's probably very similar, at least conceptually, to Apollo. It's like Apollo had, post TLI, you had maybe more capability with the Apollo SPS, Surface Propulsion System engine, because of the Delta V capability of the Apollo service module. But at some point, you lose that direct abort capability, and you have to go around the moon. And there's that sort of line of demarcation is probably drawn differently for Orion with SLS, or Orion with Starship, or Orion with whatever. But it's probably a similar conceptually. There's just some point where you lose that direct abort capability, because I guess it depends, because again, if you can use Starship, again, thinking about the Apollo 13 case, so you have a direct abort capability with one of the ships, but it may not be available to you because it depends on what the issue is. So on Apollo 13, you lost the command service module abort capability, and you had to use a lunar module, and they opted for a number of reasons to go around the moon and not necessarily minimize the amount of return time. They had other considerations there. So it's the same kind of thing. If you have an issue with Orion and Starship is capable of doing the abort burn, then you may have a significant direct abort capability for a lot longer. But if the issue's with Starship, then you still have an abort capability with Orion. It's just that you still have that line of demarcation somewhere where you lose the direct abort capability and you still have to go around the moon. So see, I think that is one of those questions. Could the Blue Origin architecture, which is it's not refueling per se, but it's still multiple launches where you're essentially ganging together 3 or 4 transfer stages, whatever those are, together. They still have to rendezvous and dock somehow. Could you launch additional stages to support an Earth orbit rendezvous capability? That's just it's essentially a rhetorical question. We don't know, because as I said at the outset, assuming that they're going to qualify and certify Centaur 5 to work with SLS will still have the capability to support either of those. It'll either be able to support Earth orbit rendezvous or lunar orbit rendezvous. So it's more of a question of what is feasible for the lunar lander providers in the next 2 years, because they'll still have to, since there will still be, as somebody was saying in chat early, Starship is there's still going to be some number of tanker refuelings that are going to be necessary to top off the HLS Starship in Earth orbit one way or another. And so again, if we're talking about a weekly launch cadence or that type of launch cadence rate that needs to be available by the time of Artemis 4, you're still probably looking at, it could be up to a month, 4 or 5 weeks, depending on how many tankers. Let's say only took a half dozen tankers, but you're only launching on a weekly basis, then you're going to need to launch HLS into orbit, perhaps a couple of months before the Orion launch. And then the tankers have to happen. It might be a little bit less than that if you want to synchronize completely. Or, I think I was talking about this during the rollout stream. Is there a depot involved in this, or does HLS serve in this case as the depot role for expediency? But if you're using a depot, then you could use a similar type of operations, I think, as let me see if I had that in that picture. I'll have to go back and see if that, because it's the other thing about this. Let's see if right. So in this case, in this graphic, this is the depot, I think. Yeah. So instead of directly refueling the lunar lander, there's a depot up there. You refuel the depot to some extent, then you launch the HLS. It goes to it rendezvous and docks with the depot, and then you do some more propellant refuelings. And again, the question is whether those are all done. Can you get away with just doing refuels in low Earth orbit, or do you need to do a little bit in low Earth orbit and a little bit in the final tanking orbit? Again, if we're talking about lunar orbit rendezvous. But if not, again, the bigger picture question is, how much time do you have to devote to that tanker campaign ahead of launching Orion? And so that's, we will have to see. But it won't be, even if you were to say we're going to try and launch Artemis IV by the end of the first quarter of 2028, you'd still probably at this point 2 years from now need to be finishing the tanker campaign, if not have already finished it. So that means the HLS needs to be ready to fly well before the end of the first quarter of 2028. Yeah, I'm not sure. So the thing is, I think the question in terms of cost, I think is what equations and what variables are we using for the cost? So I don't know that the core stage is, I don't know what the cost of a core stage unit is. I'm not sure it's that it's in the hundreds of millions. It might be, you might need another zero. I don't know. Especially if you only make like 5 or 6 of them. So it's one of those questions is what are you using to calculate the per unit cost? But it is fair to say they're both expensive, both the RS-25 and the core stage. But again, we're not using, what are we using to calculate per unit costs? It might be a little different from one production site and production facilities to another, but still it would be interesting to see what, and of course we can't get that data. I'm not sure we could get it even for the government with a FOIA request, for the Freedom of Information Act request. I'm not sure we could get reliable data that was, that had enough detail in it. Because again, you're talking about, for instance, what are the costs? Do you factor the costs of who pays for, again, I've mentioned this before, what pays to maintain the machine assembly facility, for instance? Does it come out of a program? Does it come out of the, and because that facility waited a long time, just as an example, that facility waited a long time for tornado repairs, for instance. I think that the money to repair some of the facility after the tornado went through there didn't show up for another 3 or 4 years. So it wasn't getting that money on an annual basis. And again, that was something they intentionally put in the big beautiful bill. It wasn't on the order of the amount of money given to the SLS, the Artemis 4 and 5 SLS or the Gateway, because that was the bulk of the $10 billion. But there was something like $500 million for facilities in there because they just let it go. But then how do you calculate? Because then some of the maintenance and service costs are paid by something, and so does that come out of the SLS costs? Does that come out of the SLS budget, as an example? It's like, so how's that factor into the per unit cost of a core stage, for instance? I saw, where did it go? There it is. Okay, so it's not an answer, but the question is what will happen to Mobile Launcher 2? So there's a few possibilities. First is it's just going to be scrapped. I would say it's very unlikely that it's just going to be fully demolished. It's just what's going to happen is it's what we thought was going to happen in reverse between Mobile Launcher 1 and Mobile Launcher 2. What we thought was going to happen with Exploration Upper Stage and Block 1B and Mobile Launcher 2 was that they were going to retire Mobile Launcher 1 and basically sort of pick the carcass of the mobile launcher. So they would take they would use all of the parts of it, wiring parts, umbilical arms, mechanisms, as spares for Mobile Launcher 2. What would make sense now is just having the roles reversed. So the Mobile Launcher 2 systems perhaps were not completely integrated and assembled, but there will be things like cryogenic propellant skids, the valve complexes for the cryogenic propellants. There will be mechanisms and umbilical arms that will probably be saved for spares, either the larger structures like the umbilical arms or smaller parts like pumps and valve manifolds and hardware like that. They will, again, I'm using euphemistic language, but they essentially pick the carcass of the mobile launcher. That's one extreme. And then of course it will cost them money to keep that structure standing. So it will at some point they will begin to demolish what's left that they don't want to use for spare parts. That's one extreme. The other extreme would be to use it, even though NASA has said they have no plans to use it. But again, and the theoretical other extreme would be to use that for Centaur 5. I just think it's unlikely. And so I'd say those are some of the extremes, would be to finish it and just have it support Centaur 5 with the rest of the SLS. I think that's, again, unlikely because we're probably looking at a shorter SLS retirement in a shorter time frame than a longer one. We will perhaps find out here in the next week or 2 weeks when the budget request comes out what the White House wants to do, what the retirement time frame is, whether part of this deal to cancel Exploration Upper Stage is to extend SLS to maybe a 6th or 7th launch. We'll just have to see, but it's still likely to come on Mobile Launcher 1. So it's less likely that they're going to finish Mobile Launcher 2 and more likely that they're going to scavenge parts and structures and whatever else they can off of it for spare parts and then demolish it, basically. Again, unless their plans have changed. But again, they just announced them less than a month ago, and so I wouldn't imagine that they're going to change that quickly. I think it's much more likely that we're going to see them, I don't know what you would call it, but take Mobile Launcher 2 apart in some way, shape, or form as soon as they can. Again, I don't know whether they have the legal authority to do that yet, but it might take until they might be able to do some of it now and then some of it later. But, again, assuming that Congress is on board with that plan, they can probably go ahead and start doing that before they change the law. It's really, there's, you can probably look at I don't know that there is any language that prevents them from doing that, but it's more likely that that's what's going to happen, is it's going to be scavenged for spare parts and then demolished. just didn't make a, whoops. Just making an archive here. Eric's asking, will I be somewhere else to visit people? I don't think I'm going to have enough time because this is not what I'm still planning the same thing. I'm still planning on covering the mission. And so we have so many people. There's so much media who are going to be there in person at Kennedy Space Center to cover the launch and the spectacle of the launch. I want to cover the mission, and so I'm going to go to Houston. The day my plan is to go to Houston before the launch. So, or maybe a better way of putting it is, I'm planning to be in Houston when the mission starts, and so yeah, I'm not expecting. If I knew that there was if there was something to stay in Florida for besides the, I'm not taking any pictures. I'm just going to be covering the mission. So, but if there was a good enough reason to stay, I would stay. If I could just watch the launch as a spectator, then yeah, I would love to stay in Florida and just watch it as a spectacle. But because I want to cover the mission and report on it, I'm not planning to be in Florida at the time that it lifts off. It's more about, and they're planning on compressing the NASA availability of NASA leadership and subject matter experts into the 3 days or so before launch. So it really is going to be, it's going to be getting in and getting out of Florida quickly. So I don't expect to have a lot of spare time. And unfortunately, that's the way that this goes. It's like, that's why, if you guys think that I'm rushed a lot, I am, because that's just the way it is now. Is we do not have time to relax and do things in a more casual manner. Everything, you have less time to do what you want to do than you ever, than ever. And so it's like, we just don't have, we have the opposite of luxury in terms of time. There's not enough time. There's so many questions to ask. There's so many things. And so any opportunity we get to speak with NASA and or contractor officials, you have to be ready to take advantage of that, even if it's not as much time as you would like. And so I expect this to just be a rush. But that's kind of the way it is all the time anyway. So. Let me see if I lost my spot again. Because I'm always behind. It's hard for me to keep up with you guys. Let me see. Okay, that's where we are now. I should have remembered the timestamp. Okay, there it was. Okay, I found it now. No, that's probably a good way of doing it. So the question is, okay, so there was a question about making the RS-25 engines for Artemis 5. So that's correct. So they have 4 sets of engines, 4 sets of 4 for Artemis, for Artemis 1 through 4, but and they restarted RS-25 production, as Chad has been talking about. They restarted it a long time ago, and they've already reached the point where they have delivered in place 2 of the first 2 production restart engines. So the first one was acceptance tested, I guess it would have been last June, and then the second one was acceptance tested in the fall. I can't remember if it was November, but it was in the fall. And so we might, somewhere in this time frame, we might see the third one tested. But in theory, they'll have what they'll need for Artemis 5 is they will need a set of 4 and then some number of backups. I think ideally they would have the next set that would in theory be assigned to Artemis 6 done, so that they would have 8 engines done, and they probably will have time to do that if they can test the complete production of the different builds and final assembly of engines on sort of a quarterly basis. They should have the first set of 4 done sometime this year, and those actually will end up being backups for the Artemis 4 set. And then the next set they will probably need for, well, they probably won't need them, I would say, until the end of next year, maybe a little bit farther. They may have maybe the next 2 years to get those done. But so if we assume that their assignment is to have 6 more engines to give them a total of 8 new engines done in the next 2 years, it would seem like they're on track to do that. It's possible. I guess it's possible if there was somebody that wanted to, they could, I guess, the formal process for demolishing the mobile launcher probably includes going through a formal sort of excess process. So they probably will have to formally offer some part of it, I guess, for to be accessed. But again, I don't know. Again, to me, it seems like, considering the costs and considering all of the other considerations, such as needing to continue to coexist with SLS, at least for the next probably give or take 3 years, that they would want to, that you're talking about New Glenn, the New Glenn with the 9 first stage engines and the 4 second stage engines, using Mobile Launcher 2. I can't imagine it. Well, that isn't, I can't imagine it, but that would require a significant amount of money that Blue Origin would have to invest, because you would obviously have to bring all of the other capabilities to Pad 39B. You can't use Pad 39A because SpaceX has got that rented out for a long time. You can't use Pad 39B as is because it does not support the New Glenn first stage as is. It would need to be expanded, and that would require a significant amount of money. You maybe are not going to be able to make a significant amount of those modifications for the next 3 years. And so, looking at cost benefit, I'm not sure, just because that thing's standing there, that it's cheaper to retrofit that to fly New Glenn on it than to purpose build another pad, to do it clean, to do a clean sheet design, to design the pad and the infrastructure there to their requirements directly, as opposed to retrofitting something that was not designed or built for New Glenn. Again, I don't know what the cost, I don't know what the trade-offs there are and pros and cons, but it would seem like there would be more benefits than costs to doing a purpose-built launchpad infrastructure for a second, for this upgraded New Glenn vehicle, unless they can extend the Pad 36 infrastructure to do that. And I would imagine that would still be cheaper than Mobile Launcher 2. So, but we will see if it has to go through that excess process where they would have to offer it up. But the other thing, of course, is that if they want to use some of the equipment on the mobile launcher for spares, since it is the government's property right now, they may not get, who knows how much capability and parts you're going to still have when the government, when Expedition Ground Systems gets done with it, picking the carcass, so to speak. See, I would think once SLS is retired, whenever that's going to be, and again, that still has to be, that is still a question as to whether, even though this looking at what's part of the new plan and what they've discarded, and then looking at last year's plan, it does seem like SLS retirement is on the table right now, so we would have to confirm for sure, even if it looks like it, and it's worth saying, this plan looks like that plan, the plan from last year, which began with cancel the SLS upgrades and then transition and retire. Once that's done, though, then in theory you could, but then that's another thing too, which is similar to what SpaceX did with Pad 39A. Wouldn't Blue Origin want to build a fixed service structure like they have at Pad 36 out at, if they were to lease 39B? And of course, what about SpaceX? Does SpaceX want to use that? Who's gonna, is there a bidding war for that? So first you have to find out when SLS is going to be retired, but I wouldn't imagine that they would get that until after SLS is retired. But still, I would see if Starship took over that pad, I would imagine you would see the same type of pad built on the 39B property that you're seeing built either at Starbase now. Well, that's actually just being activated right now, or at Pad 37, and then if it's Blue, maybe the same type of thing. It's just it would look like the Blue infrastructure. But if you look at the Blue infrastructure, or generically, you have a horizontal integration facility. It's much closer to the pad, and then you have fixed service structures at the pad, like Shuttle used to have, and obviously like SpaceX has right now at 39A, and Blue has at Pad 36. So I don't know. I'm not sure just because it's there that it's that easy or that cheap to modify, that it might actually be more expensive than purpose building and something that you already have. Like Blue already has the blueprints for a New Glenn pad. And so again, it might be cheaper to just demolish the Pad 39B structures and save what you can. Again, similar to what SpaceX did with 39A. That's an interesting question. So yeah, the question about renting or buying I mean, they're going to be renting starships to fly lunar missions at some point. Well, actually, they're doing that. They will be doing that right now. They're only buying them for the lunar landing part of it. So right now, NASA is going to fly their crews at least into orbit on Orion, fly them into orbit, and then return them to Earth on Orion. But they're renting the lunar lander to take them down to the surface of the moon, whether that's from Earth orbit or from lunar orbit. In terms of buying something, it depends on how you define things, because SpaceX has already talked, or maybe it wasn't SpaceX, it may have been the HLS programs themselves, but that there will be dedicated units dedicated to NASA and HLS, but I would assume that those would still be owned and operated by SpaceX. It's just that they would be dedicated to, they would have landers and a depot and perhaps tankers that were dedicated to NASA use. But again, NASA would still be, SpaceX would still be operating those for NASA. Yeah, that was something. It was sort of hinted at in remarks during the week about not necessarily landing at the South Pole for the initial landings. If that helps the providers, that would in theory that would make it would provide several advantages in terms of either performance or more favorable terrain for initial landings. Something that's just more favorable, not as rocky, more flatter, better terrain for initial landings to get to get some experience with that first. So it makes sense to do that. What would be interesting is how that affects, again, the concept of operations for Artemis 4 and 5 for sure. If not, how long they would continue with that and when they would be looking to go to the South Pole. That I think again, we just generally speaking, that's an overall takeaway or an overall observation about what we know about the current plan. Is it's just very vague. We really don't have, we're getting these little bits and pieces, but it just needs a lot more detail to understand what they're trying to accomplish with the first couple of landings. Because the flip side of it is they're already talking about initial deployments for the moon base. And so if you're not going to, if they're going to establish a moon base at somewhere besides the South Pole, what does that mean? Does that mean then that they're going to focus on a different site for the first moon base, and that they're going to have multiple? I assume that, again, you would want to at some point, but how many moon bases are we talking about? Or are they going to just land, again, do these demonstration landing missions somewhere besides the South Pole, but then start doing moon base landings at the South Pole, and then eventually an Artemis crew will land there? Because they did talk about the moon base in concert with, I think, Artemis 5. So again, there's just a lot of missing detail here to understand what they're doing, what their plans are, because I'm assuming that they have maybe not a fully detailed plan, but that they have more details to the plan than they've disclosed so far. Well, I mean, I think the EUS capability is I mean, there's a sort of a chicken and egg thing there too, because I think when they first conceptualized EUS, it was just considered one of the first upgrades, and they were still talking about SLS as a generic or a more general launcher, more general purpose launcher. So you could use it to fly cargo. But as another example, if you weren't going to fly a gateway and EUS existed right now and was operational and you could fly and it was flying, you might be able to use that 10 metric ton co-manifest capability for a mission module that gets Orion down to low lunar orbit, for instance. Kind of like what we're seeing the design of the Chinese lunar lander, where they've got I forget what the name of the transfer stage. It may be called the transfer stage, but that you have a transfer stage that takes Orion down to low lunar orbit and then it's disposed of. But again, if you can get Orion to low lunar orbit with full tanks, then it has the capability to return to Earth from there. So that would be another, again, conceptually, because again, the problem with the EUS, more than what it is and is not capable of doing, especially for the problem that we're in right now, we being the United States, is just that it's not available. And it's not going to be available for, it may be, it's not clear when it's going to be available. And again, I think the contention is unstated that it was not going to be available, not only by the time of when they want Artemis IV to fly, but that it might not be available until after Artemis V. So that's, that I think was their one of their showstoppers. Maybe even more of a showstopper for right now under these conditions than the cost. But again, obviously that is attached to the availability issue. Is they're spending all of this money, it's not ready, they don't know when it's going to be ready, and then that cost continues to, you're continuing to pay for it, and it's not going to be ready to accomplish your near-term goals. So all right, let's see. So yeah, the question. So yeah, somebody asked earlier, do I think they will? I think there's a chance, or do I think they will fly on April 1st? I think there's a good chance they're going to make a launch attempt, but I just don't know what we're going to see when they tank the vehicle on. We don't. It's hard to have. I at least understand their thinking after listening to the news conference. What was it? It may have only been a little bit more than a week ago, but at least understand, because that was my question, was if they're not going to do a tanking test before the launch attempt, why? And they explained why they don't think they need to do another tanking test. But there's still some uncertainty there. And so I think there's a decent chance that they're going to be ready to try on April 1st. But then it's sort of reserving judgment, I guess, until after we see what happens when they start filling the core stage liquid hydrogen tank. So if I would say, and so this is what I said before Artemis 1 was, I kind of thought there was a 50-50 chance that they would launch on any particular attempt. And so I would say, considering they had another hydrogen leak, that's probably about where it is now. But then once we get into tanking and we see whether they have, how things are going, if they don't have an issue with the hydrogen leak after they tank the vehicle, then I think the odds go up significantly. And then it becomes more of a question of whether. And then, again, this vehicle's only gone through, only been launched once. They did put this vehicle through 2 terminal countdown runs, but in the wet dress rehearsal on the 19th of February. So that at least builds some confidence. But again, because there's just so little experience with this, you just don't know. I think we're now seeing that this is one of the arguments that they're making for they need to increase the cadence of the system, is for not for overall reliability in terms of mission reliability, but just launch operations and making those more reliable, that when you tank the vehicle that it's ready to launch, and then you have to worry, and you're only worrying about the weather, generally speaking. So that's why it's hard to just say, I think they'll launch whenever they tank next time. It is possible, but I don't know that I would necessarily certainly before they tank, I don't know what I would say. I would say about 50-50 chance. Just depends on what we see when they tank the vehicle, when they tank the vehicle for this first launch attempt. And there's a decent chance it'll be on the 1st of April. So this will probably be, I think I'll probably go ahead and close here with this. So I see some questions in chat about repurposing the gateway modules or flying the gateway anyway and taking those modules up another way. I think for the European partners, I think the question is who's going to pay for that, and what's the value in doing that if NASA's basically telling them we don't have any interest in using Gateway at this point. And so if you wanted to, would NASA let them use the Gateway modules? I'm not even sure NASA is going to launch the PPE and Halo modules now as is, or put them in that orbit. So like I don't know. I don't see them. I don't know what options they're going to have, basically. So that's obviously an open question until they meet and we hear. And again, we don't even know. We see it sounds like they're going to meet next, or I guess this week now, that they're going to meet this week, but we don't know if we're going to hear anything substantive until we may not hear anything about what they talked about, because they may not be done talking. So we may not hear much of anything. I don't know that we're necessarily going to hear something conclusive or definitive this week. We'll just have to see. So, but I don't know what options the Europeans are going to be left with by the U.S. Because the U.S. could choose not to launch any Gateway elements. So what do? Do you buy them? If you really want to fly the Gateway, do you buy those off the United States? And how do you do that? And again, I don't know that Europe might not be interested in doing that if the United States basically tells them we're done with Gateway, whether unilaterally. This would not be the first time that that's happened, where the U.S. has basically backed out. And it's like, unfortunately, I'm not sure Europe is in a position to really continue on. There were some missions where they did that, but they probably weren't of this cost magnitude either. So, I mean, I'm definitely going to be, we're just as a matter of, these are programs that are still Artemis programs, at least as of now, is to have, and again, maybe we will get this in the budget request that we will see, because in the last budget request, NASA and the administration spelled out exactly what they wanted, what they were planning. They said in the fiscal year 2026 budget request, they said we're canceling Gateway right now, we're canceling the SLS upgrades right now, and then we will after Artemis III, we will cancel Exploration Ground Systems, Orion, and SLS. So after that, all you would have is the commercial lunar landers and the commercial lunar surface spacesuits. And then you would, in parallel with all of those, and in parallel with retiring all of the government capabilities, be taking that money and applying that to commercial contracts for lunar transportation and lunar base, etc. So we should, in theory, know what the administration plans to do with the Gateway, and probably all of this other stuff. I would imagine they're going to have to lay out their plans more explicitly here whenever the next budget request is published. And so hopefully that will be in the next. Maybe it's in the next week or so, maybe it's in the next month, or maybe it's a little longer, but sometime in the next handful of weeks we should we should find out what that is. So, but I think, so what I'm planning on doing is, I think this time next week, I'll probably end up doing something like a quarterly review, just because it's sort of a combination of a few things and a lot of missing details. And so that ends up being part of unfortunately being part of the reviewing the quarter, is you have a plan, but then you're missing a lot of details to it. But that'll probably be, that could be, I'll have to look for the right place to do that because I'll be traveling. But I'm planning on doing another members live stream on Wednesday, and then I'll be traveling after that, and I'll have to again try and find a place to slot that end of quarter thing. It's probably going to make more sense to do it before the Artemis II launch attempts begin. And again, depends on whether we get any more details or more information before the end of the month, end of the quarter or not. But regardless of whether that happens or not, I'll plan on doing more live streams as we get closer to the Artemis II launch attempt. And we'll be obviously monitoring NASA Public Affairs, hoping to get some updates, at least letting us know that they're continuing that they're either on schedule for April 1st or staying near that, so that we have, some idea that these dates are going to hold, or that they've adjusted to another date. But we have not heard anything yet that says that they can't make April 1st, and that they're still targeting that as the earliest possible opportunity to launch. So it is possible. Like, again, we did see a story saying that the FY 2027 request could be out the last week of March. And so if that's the case, then what the authorization bill, what's more likely is the authorization bill has a better chance of being passed before the budget. So they will roll out the budget request, but the actual FY 2027 budget isn't likely to be passed until after the general election here in the U.S. in November. That's unlikely. It's more of but the request and the introduction of the executive branch administration plan will probably, that'll probably happen here again in the next handful of weeks, probably before we see any movement on the NASA authorization bill. But we probably will see the authorization bill, if it's going to be approved, probably maybe in the spring, but it may drift out into the summer, or at least the early summer. And Congress has very typical, holiday patterns. So we're coming up to Easter. There'll be an Easter break here pretty soon. So if the budget isn't released before the Easter break, it'll be after, I would imagine. And we probably aren't going to see a lot of legislation until after the Easter break anyway. There's obviously still a big deal going on with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security budget and related agencies. So that's the top priority right now. And perhaps they will delay the budget request release until after that's settled, if that's going to be settled. So we'll just have to see what happens with that. But we should see that again, unless something figuratively blows up and everybody just leaves town and doesn't want to talk to each other. We should see that budget request relatively soon, but that's just the request. So. Okay, so yeah, that's where I think that's a good place to stop for the week. And we'll obviously, this is going to be the primary focus, but because we've had this big change in plans and there are some big question marks, anything we find out in the next week and a half before, during, and after Artemis II is still going to be, that is one of those elephants in the room. The newest elephant in the room is how they're going to, when they're going to fly Artemis 3, 4, and 5, how they're going to make those dates happen, and all of those details that are still missing. And so even though this is probably will be the focus, I don't think that those big questions are going anywhere. And I think we will see people ask them in parallel with this. And so we will see what we get here in the next couple of weeks, again, before, during, and after Artemis II, depending on whether it flies here in the next week or not. So I think that it now has this thing that's sort of operating in parallel with the mission, because we have so little time. We, being the United States, have so little time to fly these 4 missions in less than 3 years. Then we have just the next 3 missions to the lunar landing. We have 2 years or less to get 3 missions launched. And so it's hard to escape that reality, even though this mission itself is a big deal and still hasn't flown yet. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Hope to see many of you again at the next live stream. I'll publish the schedule for that as travel plans and schedules firm up. Right now all of the travel plans are based on an April 1st launch, and we'll have to see if that date holds. But I'll try and schedule the next live streams here in the next couple of days, and I'll post updates on my channel. But again, thanks everybody for your time. Thanks to the members for the channel for all the support as usual. I will see you guys on Wednesday, and thanks everybody again for hanging out in the live stream and the questions.